Thanks very much, Des, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely for Gillian and I to share some time with you this morning as we think of our Lord and all he's done for us. We've each had a wonderful opportunity these last few years to reflect deeply on our lives. COVID-19 has thrown everything upside down. During the height of lockdown last year, a number of people said to me that they were going to make some changes in their life. Maybe some of you actually said that during the lockdown last year. Did you make positive change? And if you did make some changes as a result of last year's lockdown, did it actually last? Because often a reflection process that we come across in our life from time to time collapses when normality returns. I know I've returned home from a Bible week or a conference energized and fired up to do things differently. But unfortunately, routine sets in again quickly and the feeling dissipates. And of course, each year at New Year's time, we know many people make New Year's resolutions. But unfortunately, some of those become new month resolutions because they don't last beyond January the 31st. And some of them even become new week resolutions because they don't even make the week. And I hate to say it, but some are actually only New Year's Day resolutions because we don't even manage to carry them through to January 2nd. And what about this recent lockdown? More severe for many of us than last year, but another opportunity to review and to make changes perhaps in our lives. What is your one-line summary of your life in 2020? And what do you think you'll say about 2021 as you look back on this year next January? Will we be focused on what has been happening around us in the world, or will we look more deeply at ourselves? As Des said, we do come together Sunday by Sunday to examine ourselves. Now, if you're on Facebook, the wall on your profile page is really a public forum for you to communicate with your Facebook friends and they in turn to send messages to you. You can add information to your wall and others can post information on your wall also. And many employers now check out job applications on Facebook because they find that they learn a lot about someone from their wall. And if I look at your personal walls, what will I actually see? And I'd like you to hold that thought in your mind as we come to Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5 and the writing on the wall for him. Just a little bit of history. In 600 BC, we know that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took control of Israel and captives were brought from Jerusalem, Daniel, of course, being one of them. We're now in Daniel chapter 5 in about 539 BC. Nebuchadnezzar has died and we read about Belshazzar having this grand party. And we find in this chapter that God intervenes. He intervenes as he had previously done in Nebuchadnezzar's life. And on this occasion, we find that God actually writes on Belshazzar's wall. Belshazzar, of course, might have preferred to write his own message on the wall, but it was God who actually did the writing. And there's such a lot of important messages come to us from what Ross read to us from Daniel chapter 5. Now, first of all, of course, we see that Belshazzar was actually an arrogant man. He was filled with pride. He was feeling very happy, yes. But as part of that happiness, as part of that pride, he thought he had the right to use the holy things that had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar years before from God's temple. He wanted to do what he liked with those things. He wanted to carry out the choices he had himself in his life with no regard to anyone around him or to God. Of course, we also find something very important in the exchange that happened between Daniel and Belshazzar in this chapter. Belshazzar had not learned from history. Sometimes we don't learn from history. The Bible is there before us, but do we just read the lessons without taking note of them for ourselves? I'm sure Belshazzar had a good education. I'm sure he had heard about the experiences of Nebuchadnezzar before him. But here we've got Daniel reminding Belshazzar that Nebuchadnezzar had to learn a lesson about pride the hard way. And that picture is one artist's impression of what Nebuchadnezzar would have looked like during that period of his life when God intervened so drastically and dramatically in his life. And of course, as the party proceeded and the hand appeared writing on the wall, Belshazzar reacted with fear, with terror even. Let's read again those words about Belshazzar. The king's countenance changed. His thoughts troubled him so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. Aren't they expressive words? It's a lovely picture of that awful feeling we get when we're overcome with fear and anxiety, guilt even. And it's worth thinking for a moment what was going through Belshazzar's mind as those words were written and he experienced this incredible opportunity for introspection from outside of himself. How much of his fear was superstition? How much of it was guilt in thinking back over what he had done? And we're told what God wrote about this man on the wall. And I'm quite sure that Belshazzar wasn't terribly happy with it. God has numbered your kingdom, he was told, and finished it. The middle one, perhaps most personal of all, the word tekel. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. I've looked at you, Belshazzar, and you haven't lived up to your responsibilities. You haven't lived up to your capability or the capacity you had to do something good in the situation in which you found yourself. And then finally, Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now think about ourselves for a moment. It's fine to focus, of course, on Belshazzar, but if God was writing on the wall of our home, as we have a celebration, as perhaps many of us hope to do in a few weeks with our families, our broader families, or our friends at the end of this long lockdown period, what would God write on the wall of your dining room? Would the words that appeared there be positive or negative? What is so scary about this story is that as Belshazzar and his friends, all 1,000 plus of them, partied, they were actually surrounded by enemies. History tells us that the Medes were busy diverting the river that ran through the city of Babylon so they could walk in under the gates, protecting the city. And all of those in charge, those who should have been watching and ready, were having a party. And sometimes you and I are in party mode and we become unaware of the spiritual enemy that surrounds us in our life. We think that life is continuing as normal, that things are going great, in fact. We're enjoying the moment as Belshazzar was. when instead we should be preparing for battle, whatever that battle happens to be in our life. And so the lesson of Belshazzar is with us today. Yes, those flaming letters on the wall have faded, but the reminder remains to you and to me to turn to God today whilst there's still time. We must not wait until destruction is imminent. We must do what we can do now while we have opportunity. God is watching what we do every moment of every day. To some people, that will bring fear, terror even, as it did to Belshazzar there in Daniel chapter 5. But to others, and hopefully to all of us here, the fact that God is watching us will actually be a comfort, a support, an encouragement. Many around us don't care about God at all, but we have a relationship with him. And for us, yes, we need to respect him, but we can love him for all that he has done for us and all that he wants to do with us if we put our hearts and minds with him. So if God chose to write on the wall of your family room today, what would those words say? Perhaps we can use some of the words that Jesus himself said during his ministry. To some, in one of the parables, he said, "Well done, good and faithful servant." This one's not quite so pleasant when he said, "I never knew you. Depart from me." Or would the message that Jesus gave to us be perhaps a little longer? I've given you so much. I wish you would have spent more time with me. I wish you would have done more for me. Belshazzar was brought face to face with his failure, too late to do anything about it. And for us, the time will come when our opportunity is gone. It will either be the end of our life or it will be Jesus coming back to the earth. And Jesus' return can be a time of great excitement and joy for us, but equally a time of fear and guilt. And we make the choice as to how we want that time to be right here and now, today, not in the future. And then we come over to John chapter 8 and to the reading that George did for us from there. The Bible talks about writing on the ground, not just writing on the wall. And here in John chapter 8, we find the story of Jesus and this woman who is caught in adultery. The Jewish leaders thought they had Jesus tricked. They had him, but they failed again to catch him out because, of course, they didn't understand him at all. There are, of course, many different views as to what Jesus wrote in the dust as they stood before him. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that whatever it was that Jesus wrote in that dust, in that dirt, in that earth, had a dramatic impact on those around him. Perhaps he wrote something about each man in the dust, starting from the eldest, a word or two, a phrase about each one of them, and they gradually departed from him. They knew their Old Testament very well, and they would, I think, have been very familiar with words in Jeremiah 17. Jeremiah wrote these words at a time when the nation of Israel were in great trouble. "O Lord," he wrote, "the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be ashamed. Those who depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters." God said that the names of those who depart from him would be written in the earth. And perhaps in these words in John 8, perhaps Jesus wrote the reference to that passage in Jeremiah on the ground. And then their names from the eldest to the youngest, one by one, below the reference. And if we stood before Jesus today, what would he write on the earth in front of us? I do love the beautiful contrast between this verse in Jeremiah chapter 17 and the other picture in the Bible of the book of life. Have you thought about that before? What it means to have your name written in the earth and what it means to have your name written in the book of life? Think about some of the verses we find about this book of life in the Bible. We've got this one in Exodus when Moses pleaded for Israel with God and said, offered to God, yet now, if you will forgive their sin, but if you won't, Father, blot out me, Moses said, out of your book, which you have written. And of course, these same ideas come out in Revelation chapter 13, when it talks about those whose names have not been written in the book of life, who will not be part of God's glorious kingdom. And that warning at the very end of the book in Revelation, that God will take away the part from the book of life of those who have taken away from the book of the prophecy that Jesus gave to John. The book of life is where God writes the names of the faithful. And the emphasis of that book is on life, the gift that he has promised. And that perhaps as we think back to Jeremiah, when God or Jesus writes your name in the earth, it means you're going to return to dust. And the punishment to Adam for his sin, in the early chapters of Genesis, God said, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. The book of life is preserved. It's cared for by God himself. But just a gentle breeze, a slight wind, and the names of those written in the dust will be obliterated forever. Some people spend a great deal of time deciding what to write on the gravestone of a family member as a summary of their life. When my mum passed away, the funeral people even sent us a list of suggestions, pages after page after page, of what we might like to put on her gravestone. Of course, carefully selected to fit with the number of letters they would allow within the size of the plaque itself. And of course, when we look at the Bible, there are no examples of Bible tombstones, but there are other examples of God's epitaph, because often we call that message following someone's death that we put on their gravestone or in something we write about them an epitaph, because it's intended to be an expression of their values, a summary of their life. And there are a number of summaries of people's lives that we can find in the Bible. There's this one about Hezekiah, where it's written about him, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. Hezekiah could be happy about his epitaph. But what about Amaziah? He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. Not so good for him. In fact, a very bad epitaph. And there are others that are somewhere between these two extremes of good or bad. Another Amaziah, not the same one, a different one. It says about him, he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a perfect heart. Some good things about him, but other things not so good. Hosea, which is written from the other point of view. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel who were before him. He was bad, but not as bad as some of the others. If you had a choice between those four, which would you like to be used about you? I'd like to take one of the examples of one of the kings amongst that group of kings we've looked at there. I'd like to talk about King Omri, who's really relatively unknown from a Bible point of view. But if I tell you that he was Ahab's father, you might be able to guess if he was good or bad. Historians actually view with surprise the Bible record about this man, King Omri. A man called J.A. Thompson, who wrote a book called The Bible and Archaeology, said these words: kings like Omri merit only denunciation in the religious sphere, but archaeology shows us that the case is quite different in the political and economic spheres. And in his book, Thompson writes about the very significant contributions that were made by Omri in politics and economics. The foundations of the city of Samaria were laid by this man. In international politics, Omri is well known. He's referred to in both Assyrian and Moabite records. Archaeology tells us that Omri, king of Israel, reconquered and subdued Moab that had been lost years before after Solomon's death. And yet, from a Bible perspective, when Omri's life is condensed by God, there are only 6 verses referred to him, and they make very, very sad reading. It's in 1 Kings chapter 16. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel, and he reigned 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shema for 2 talents of silver. Then he built on the hill and called the name of the city which he built Samaria, after the name of Shema, owner of the hill. And here is the crux of it. Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did worse than all who were before him. For he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sin by which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and the might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Omri rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria. Then Ahab his son reigned in his place. Omri might have done many mighty and significant things as a king, but as a follower of God, he completely failed. God looks at the value of our lives in such a different way to society, a different way to our employers, a different way even sometimes than our families look at us. And Omri was a great failure from God's point of view. These words from Hosea have a lot to teach us too. Talking about some of the people of his time, they sin more and more. They've made for themselves molded images, idols of their silver according to their skill. All of it is the work of craftsmen. I'm sure it was all very beautiful, and it all looked really lovely, and it adorned their places of worship and their houses and their community centers and all of the beautiful buildings they had. They say of them, Hosea continues, let the men who sacrifice kiss the calves. And this is Hosea's take on them. They shall be like the morning cloud and like the early dew that passes away, like chaff blown off from a threshing floor and like smoke from a chimney. And Hosea picks up 4 common pictures in the Bible of the morning cloud, which lasts such a small amount of time and then is gone. The early dew, which again is there for a little while but quickly dries out as the sun comes up. Or the chaff blown away from the wind on the top of the hill as the farmer threshes the grain. And smoke from a chimney which quickly disperses into the atmosphere. These things do not remain long term because they have no lasting value. And Peter makes a comparison between these sorts of things and God's words when he says, all flesh is as grass and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers and its flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. If God decides to make a record of your life, if he decides to write down a record of my life, what would it say? There are also some other uses of this idea of writing things down or writing on things in the Bible. This one on Revelation, we find amongst the 144,000, the Father's name being written on their foreheads. By looking at these people, we can see who they have connected themselves with. They are showing in their lives the glory of God. That is written on their foreheads. Can God say that about us? And then there's this beautiful picture also in Revelation of those who are going to be given a white stone. To him that overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat. I will give him a white stone. And on that stone, a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. We're not quite sure what that new name means, but clearly it's something that will associate us forever with the Lord. Is this white stone coming our way with a new name written on it? So let's think about ourselves as we come now to take bread and wine. What about you? What about me? Belshazzar would have loved to write on that wall what he thought about himself and how great he clearly felt that he was. And the Jewish leaders in Jesus' time would have loved to write in the dust nice things about themselves because they also thought that they were pretty good, certainly far superior to the Son of God who stood before them. They had so much to learn. And many of the kings of Israel and Judah perhaps thought that God's summary of their life was inaccurate or incomplete. Each of us would like to choose a nice epitaph to summarize our life. And in fact, some people do. They leave very strict instructions that when they die, these are the words that they want to be remembered by. Some people go to enormous efforts to prepare their funeral because they think that their children won't do a good enough job. So best to be ready beforehand. But it's not our job to write our epitaph. It's really the work of God and Jesus to put on our gravestone the one-liner of what our life has been. Paul said some very wise words when he wrote this in Corinthians. For not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. This is such an obvious statement, of course. But why do we so often delude ourselves and think that the more times we say or think something about ourselves, the truer it becomes? And to return to where we started, to Facebook, what do you write on your wall in Facebook? Is your faith visible? Or are your social media accounts filled with things of no value? Do you hide the person that you really want to be? Is your commitment to God apparent to even a casual passerby, a person just casually looking at the circumstances of your life? What do we want to show? Is God's glory being reflected in us every moment of every day? If we were standing before Jesus as those leaders were in John 8, what would he write in the dust? Would he write things that might drive a sword into the depths of our hearts so that we slink away from him, sad or ashamed? Or would he make things or say things that would make us even more connected to who he is and who we are? And what will they say about us at our funeral? What will our epitaph be? Will it be positive? Or will the poor person conducting the funeral have to scratch around desperately looking for something of value to talk about? I hope my funeral won't be like one that I attended, where the only thing they could find to say about the lady that had died was that she liked watching Inspector Rex on TV and enjoyed playing golf. They didn't seem to be able to find anything else to talk about. They managed to get that to fill in 3/4 of an hour. If God wanted to record the summation of our life, what would he say? We come back to Brother Des's words as he introduced our exhortation, because we often remind ourselves that Paul says, when discussing the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine, so let a man examine himself, not those around us, not one another, but ourselves. And perhaps today, not just here and now as we're together, but as this week progresses, let's think about how God would summarize our life. It's not too late to make some changes. Thank you, everyone.